The first keynote of the conference is being given, as you've already heard, by Professor Ulrike Müssig, known to many of us for many years, both for her work and her regular attendance and friendship at these conferences. Professor Müssig at the University of Passau has a distinguished career with significant publications across a whole range of subjects, with perhaps constitutional and public law, or at least foundational aspects of legal systems, being one of her strengths. Significant publications have included Reconsidering Constitutional Foundations, in fact needing 2 books, Reasons and Fairness, and Legal Thinking Between Art and Mathematics. Her training consisted of visits to a number of universities and formal training in even more, but particularly noticeable are her work at the University of Würzburg, Cambridge, the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg, and of course from the year 2000 at Passau itself. As is traditional with a keynote lecture like this, there will be a chance to ask questions at the end, and Professor Müssig has kindly agreed to do her very best to answer them. Please don't take that as an opportunity to try and make it difficult, but what I will highlight at this point is we have time to discuss and engage with a really difficult and fascinating issue. You can already see on your screens the title, Rome is Not Rome, the Legal Historical Impact of Northern European Humanism, and I will hand straight over to Professor Müssig.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Spectabilis. Presidents, well, many of presidents sitting here in the audience, thanks for having me over. It's a great honor to travel and to be hosted in Hungary. If you start your travel in Passau, and if you have the Christian name Ulrike. Ulrich of Augsburg, the bishop in the 10th century, and his patron day will be the 4th of July. Might be one part of Hungarian history that you don't like that much. But if you start in Passau, we have the privilege to host this lovely Gisela Tom. So the Bavarian princess, sister of Henry II, so imperial sister, who was married to the Saint Stephen, which gives me a close relationship to Hungary, though I must admit I'm so sorry not to speak and be able to understand your native language. And having started this wonderful conference with the PhD part, there is a third linkage to Hungary, because the Hungarian colleagues, and especially Elena Balogh, they were those colleagues who started to be welcoming you if you happen to show up as an advanced PhD student at the German Legal History Conference, and none of those big ordinary professors don't really take any notice of you, then you could really rely that Elena was able to find you, to encourage you. So this is my third linkage to Hungary. Thanks a lot for having me over. Thanks a lot also for the introductory remark, and Matt was, of course, brilliant enough to set the path for this lecture, because he called on the compassion for society and the joy of sources, and these are the core elements of my talk. Rome is not Rome, the legal historical impact of Northern European humanism. So the idea is Rome is not Rome, first to draw your attention to the fact that, of course, we have the Italian Renaissance, and we've got all these wonderful, brilliant names, Lorenzo Valla, Salutati, Pico della Mirandola, and all those brilliant minds. But Rome is not only Rome, there is a heavy impact of Northern Renaissance humanism across the Alps. So therefore, Rome is not Rome. The other idea to use this title is to make the point that, from my understanding, and this comes to the first part, antiquities, well-ordered communities as templates, that those Renaissance humanist minds used the antique historical models of well-ordered societies immediately. So with an immediate approach to the sources and trying therefore to get around from the scholastic categorical Latin approach of the Mos Italicus. What they thereby also invented, and this is one of my crucial points, they invented sort of like a source of secular moral standards for private life, and we are right at the beginning of the 16th century, and also, which is even more important from the constitutional law, for public law. So this is also part of my title, Rome is not Rome, the immediate access, and I would say the rhetoric use of historical examples to explain the contemporary life of the early 16th century. And all of you know, well, Reformation is not far away. The confessional clashes on the whole continent are not far away. So perhaps those times have been as much disturbing as we sometimes feel if we read about all those wars going on nowadays. Specific of Eastern European humanism and this Celtis Hungarian context. So Konrad Celtis, one of those German Renaissance minds, so he is already within the circle of the Northern European Renaissance thinkers. He had close contacts to Matthias Corvinus' court, and he was, and this is the point that Matt was making in his introduction, he founded Soliditates, so societies of experts training Latin conversation, encouraging the application of those historical ideas to the contemporary times. Thank you. And therefore, I was really touched to see the Soliditas Vistulana, the Soliditas Danubia, also using the names of those big rivers crossing frontiers. And I think this conference is known for crossing frontiers. Third point, the humanist orientation towards a broad impact, which simply means they tried to get as much attention as a big audience as they could have. So I'm not going into the detail of some German discussions deliberating whether there is a contrast between humanism and Reformation. I leave that aside, and I would go for the argument that both Renaissance, of course, with all this lovely art, humanism and Reformation, especially the latter of those, they fall together. They coincide in a huge desire to have a broad audience. And we're going to test what this broadness would mean. And then at the end, and this is also a very important point, using the historical sources, realizing how the historical sources managed to get around with injustice. They invented a clever argumentation how to explain injustice in some certain cases. And suddenly they left sort of like the broad category of justice aside. So this is the whole program. When we start, the first point would be humanist Latin's linguistic ethical focus. So I would assume most of you have a good clue and a distinct idea what humanism is about. For our conference, for the theme that Norbert has chosen, reading primary sources, this is my first point. And I would go for the argument that the humanists did that in a very specific way. They tried to reinvent the rhetoric and the argumentative force of the classical Latin. So, see, you all know this Ciceronian guy here. So, going back to Ciceronian Latin, where you are trained at grammar school to say Cicero and not Cicero. Well, this is one of those exaggerations. What Rasmus said. Well, this doesn't really make the point. The point I'd like to make is that, and I also introduced to you this nice epigram of Konrad Celtis to say, well, the Italians might have thought that they could keep their lyrics, but of course we are clever enough also to take up the lyrics. Well, this is a very, very paraphrasing translation of this nice epigram, which by Konrad Celtis stands for my point, to say they used the classical Latin for good rhetoric in a nice poetic sense, proliferating wisdom, help for education, and then encourage people really to get involved into public life. I think this is sort of like the program sources for literae, sapientia, and eloquentia. And if you look to our society and our conference, I think this is also somehow our program. This immediate access of antiquity, and I'm sorry, I've got now these infringements of the sunlight, but I'm quite happy on this one picture. I think all these slides are online and you can really check that. This is underneath of Dürer's depiction of the four apostles, somehow his latest work that he presented to the Council of Nuremberg. So Celtis, he was contemporary of Albrecht Dürer. Albrecht Dürer was brave enough to be one of the finest artists, German artists of this Renaissance time. He was not, and it was quite a challenge and an unfortunate for him, he was not able to speak Latin. So he never really got into those Celtis societies he would have loved to belong to. But he had a very famous friend, Willibald Pirkheimer. I'm going to show you one of those Dürer's pictures in a minute, a couple of times. And what he tries is, and this is underneath, this is underneath of these apostles, he takes up the humanist ideas. He might have used the wording of Pirkheimer to say, well, now get on with the educational ideas for the Nuremberg Respublika. So the point I'm making is, within his last picture, Albrecht Dürer, sort of like he has communicated the educational humanist program into the Nuremberg City Council, sort of like telling them what is the kind of political behavior. This is the point I'd love to make. So the receptive and imitative access to this classical poetry, as we have seen with the epigram of Konrad Celtis, they were considered as means of instilling moral norms for individual and social life. This is sort of like the point I try to make with these Dürer picture. So under the feet of the apostles, which is also, there's so much symbolic within these kind of iconography. We could lecture on and on that. And the last point, and this is also attributed to the renovation of linguistic skills by the humanists, they made heavy translation works. So they translated Greek into Latin, but also from Latin into the colloquial languages. And as Norbert says, back to the primary sources, I offer my own found the sources by Ulrich Tengler, which is a lay law book of 1511. And he tries to explain a lay access to law and legal procedure. And there you find this nice differentiation between, I always get that wrong, between the scholastic universitarian Latin Ulrich Tengler says the scharfen Latin, the scharfen Latein, and the colloquial German, the verfänglichen German. So last point would be by translating Latin text into colloquial, they really gave a boost to the national colloquial languages, and then some 50 years later we see the start of law teaching in colloquial languages and so on. My next point, this is sort of underlying this idea of humanist immediate access to sources and using them as immediate examples how to well organize your communities. There is a utilitarian justification of injustice, and not explaining that on a substantial category. It's just by reusing the argument in Tacitus Annales, and to proliferate this argument, to say, habet aliquid ex iniquo omne magnum exemplum, quod contra singulus utilitate publica rependitur. So it just means this utilitate republica. You might find injustice, and it might be justified if it serves the public utility. And just take that on this formal argumentative scale. And while it's repeated and proliferated by Justus Lipsius, most of you know this brilliant Dutch mind, summa in republica multa interveniunt, que privatim iniqua, respecto aliquis publici boni, aut quietatis tolerantur. So they sort of like get away with the differentiation between private and public morals. Sometimes you sneak into a bus without getting a ticket, or you try to convince your professor that you cannot meet the deadline of your seminar or whatsoever. So every human being tends to be lazy and sometimes trying to get away with arguments. And what they do is to say, well, in classics, within Tacitus, this happened to be used as an explanation for injustice in the public realm. So it also seems to be okay to use that within the private realm. And, sorry, I was too quick. This is Erasmus, depicted also by Albrecht Dürer. And of course, Albrecht Dürer doesn't know Latin, but he's got his humanist friend, Willibald Pirkheimer, who helped him with that. And the point I'd love to make with those two pictures, Erasmus and Charles V, is there was a distinct criticism among the humanists that the universal monarchy of the emperor is not sort of like the winning model. They are not convinced by this kind of universal monarchy, and Erasmus uses his Sveton edition. So about the biographies of the emperors, to explain that this is not sort of like the winning model, because if you are emperor, you don't really want to end up as Nero and these other guys. So we better get away with that, and we only leave it to the Christian peace to have that as the winning model. So therefore, those two pictures. Ad fontes, and I'm not going into substance of Machiavelli, but I'd like to draw your attention to the point that this kind of argumentative use of historical injustice can also be found with Machiavelli. And he uses this in a very interesting way from the rhetorical point. So he says, e credo computato ogni cosa. So it's like waging for the probabilities, what is better, but not on truth and not on eternity, but somehow calculated for utility and inutility. So this is very quick, but we sort of should save a little bit time. But this is my point for Machiavelli. For this reason, he sits in the midst of humanist argumentation. Summary of the first part would be, if we compare it to the medieval times, within the Renaissance humanist argumentation, the correct political action is no longer measured against a virtue of justice. I chose those pictures of the Council of Siena by Lorenzo Ambrogio, where you see those medieval ideas of the Aristotelian distributing and calculating justice. So the point is, it might well be by using the historical argument that could be injustice in some singular examples, justice loses the central point as measure of all ruling. And this was this is the idea behind this broadness they are seeking for. There is a new appreciation for public discourse. And there you could perfectly use Machiavelli. He says, well, if you are a ruler, you don't have to care for anything, but you have to care for the public opinion. It's debe anduque un principi fugere questi regi private. So, first part is done. Second part, now we sort of like go into the specifics of the Northern or Eastern European humanism and the Celtis-Hungarian contacts. There is a Renaissance focus on the free will, which is not only served by these Italian masterminds you see here on the slides, but also by Erasm de Libero Arbitrio Diatribe Sivi collation, and we see in the sources that there's a great interest in those Renaissance questioning how could you bring together human free will, individual autonomy, and the idea of God's omnipotence. A very nice coinage of Matthias Corvinus, and these are the explanations on the Hungarian Renaissance. There are some efforts to found universities, thereby inviting humanist scientists. There was a longing also, I think it was the father of Matthias Corvinus, to get the humanists' advice how to deal with these bloody Turks. Don't want to be deteriorating with the bloody, but in the same, just describing the historical situation before or on the road to 1526 in Mohács. And there was a great admiration of the Florence court of the Medici, all their art and also all their argumentation. Well, this is sort of like, this seems to be the surrounding where then Konrad Celtis started to be interested. And he is counselor, he is advisor, and there are some heavy links to Hungary. And of course, you all know Matthias Corvinus, he was wedded to Beatrix of Aragon. He had his chancellor and former tutor, Ivan Vitej, and you have the Academia Corvina in Buda, you have the foundation of the Universitas Istropolitana in Bratislava, and then this lovely Corvinian library, as well as printing houses in Pressburg and Oven. So it means, and we could, well, perhaps we should discuss that over coffee talk, not to take you away from cake and coffee. But there are some specificities of the Hungarian humanism. There's no Minnesang, there's no chivalry poems. there seems to be a very specific continuation of Latinity. So I mentioned Gisela, you know Stephen, so you know you've got a very heavy Latin tradition where the humanists could just cling on. They don't have to reinvent the colloquial usage of Latinity, which was common usage in Hungary anyway. And therefore, I would say, or I would like to make the point, there was a specific readiness in Hungary to welcome humanism. And one of those figures, as I told you, was this Konrad Celtis Protopius. He was associated with Matthias Corvinus Court since 1482, and he founded this Sodalitas Vistulana as the first academic society north of the Alps. And then also we discussed yesterday evening that your Danube should better be called the Inn, so he should have known it also better. But of course, within the Soliditas Danubia Hungary sat very, very comfortably. And as Celtis was a student of Rodulfus Agricola, there was a great sympathy for Erasmus' theology derived from rhetoricism. So this would be another point to make, that all the church critique that Erasmus was making, he was using language and trying to treat the biblical texts with a philological interest, taking into account the criticizing impact this kind of revealing church translation mistakes would make. This is just very, very quick on this slide. These are the different types of literature that Celtis and his guys, they produced. They collected ancient maps, they collected ancient narratives, ancient poems, they made poems themselves. They tried to serve all the emperors, so Maximilian I, also Charles V. This is sort of like the whole range of their outcome. Now my third point, and here you find the promised Willibald Pirkheimer, this friend of Dürer, and this is also a printing by Dürer. On the left-hand side, you find the arms of this Vienna philosophical mathematical collegium that Celtis has invented and founded. And the point to make is that the sodalities were scholarly circles. The name of sodales, of their members, tries to make a kind of equality. The capability to speak the classical Latin seemed to be an entrance condition, not really conditio sine qua non. So if you're not that capable to speak classic Latin, but you have some other, don't know, contacts, wealth, you might be incorporated, though Albrecht Dürer, he never reached it to be. And there was some kind of self-esteem to have a joy in society and the braveness and the joy in reading those classical sources. In addition, and this is the point I'm trying to make, they are not shut down to discuss only their own academic ideas, sort of like circling around themselves, but there was a very specific commitment to bring your ideas into the public discourse. So, for example, Willibald Pirkheimer, one of those leading humanist figures in Nuremberg, he was counselor to Maximilian, to Emperor Maximilian I. He was twice member of the city council, and Nuremberg was this imperial city that introduced the Reformation, so hosting all the imperial signs, to insert the Reformation top-down on the point of utility. So there you re-find all those argumentative tools I was trying to outline in my previous chapters. It's better, they reasoned, to have within religious affairs our own decisions, though within all imperial affairs we try to continue to be under the emperor. Well, the Nuremberg Council, they decided on advice of Celtis, on advice of Pirkheimer, to write a letter to the emperor and to explain why it was more utile to go for the Reformation and to have those 2 points, confessional things and public things of obedience to the emperor in military stuff, why to have that separated. So simply the argumentative use of utility. Okay. Then, and this is sort of like the primary source I tried to read preparing the lecture, and they circle around this Neue Laienspiegel. The first printing was in Augsburg 1509. There was a second edition 1511. It was broadly published. There were primary printings in Strasbourg, so it might be one of those most influential humanist textbooks, how to get a lay access to what law means, explained in colloquial language, and what legal proceeding is about. And there are, in the second edition, you have those imprints by Lucas Cranach, who also happened to have made the pamphlets or to make the illustrations of the reformatory pamphlets. So one of those nice Cranach ideas is here, and Ulrich Tengler explains that sort of like the Ordo Judiciarius, also das Prozessrecht, nützlich ist in seinem Zwang, weil es für jeden gilt, auch für Gott Vater. I think this is a very, sorry, it was like in German, explaining Ulrich Tengler to say, well, legal proceeding and the rules, how the court is set, they are compulsory, and there is nobody to change them, even not God. And it's fascinating what kind of iconography Ulrich Tengler uses. First of all, and this is this Cranach print, it is depicting the expulsion from paradise as a legal proceeding. So if you see this wall behind Eve and Adam and Jesus Christ as the judge standing there, this is meant to say, well, they are still within the Garden Eden, and they are within the Garden Eden. Adam has the chance to say, oh, it wasn't me, it was this female companion you gave to me, so I can't help, I had to eat this apple. You see what I mean? But the idea is to say, well, even God cannot just expel Adam out of the paradise. He has to observe the rules of the legal proceeding. This is one of those very nice examples. Well, you could go on, of course, Cranach is following that. If you look quite closely, you see the hands of Eve. So they serve the narrative that the female companion, she's cheating, she's even trying to get the scales in a different orientation. But anyway, we'll leave that out of that. So the point I'm trying to make is by explaining within this humanist way law for laymen, they get it out of the substantive academic category. So it's no longer business of legal experts, but it could be explained by using those colloquial arguments, though they don't get away with the formal bindness of the procedural rules. This is sort of like the connecting point. And this is very, very impressive. Perhaps I should continue to the next slide and the slide onwards to give you the impression that I'm inserting now an allegorical speech between mercy and justice, which was set at stage by the called Ulrich Tengler in his last judgment play, which he published only 1 year later after his lay mirror in 1512. And there, and you also have sort of like this this whole last judgment play illustrated by those nice iconography. There you've got the last judgment. But here also you have sort of like the depiction of a normal court. The judge sitting there with his assessors, and you have the same kind of remembrance, remember your responsibility at the last day. So if you read this very, very nice source, and I'm not going to crack down the timetable, but the wording is so nice, I'm very, very quick on that. Die ewig Weisheit ist keins Rat notdürftig. So eternal wisdom doesn't need any advice. Aber zu verstehen, dass am jüngsten Gericht allein die Gerechtigkeit Fürgang haben. So to make you, in order to explain to you that at the last judgment there is only strict justice and no mercy. So wird hier nach zwischengottlichen Barmherzigkeit und seiner Gerechtigkeit eine Disputation eingeführt. Means now we bring before you an allegorical battle between mercy and justice for the better argument. Who has the better argument? And if you continue with the argumentation, the both of them bring forward. Mercy says, well, human beings are the image of God. And as they are the image of God, they are so close to you, so there is no need now to get away with them. So please have mercy with them. And remember, Mother Mary and all your saints, go for that. And justice, and I made already the point that justice is then the one who wins the battle, says no. There's no mercy. It must be strict justice, because otherwise we won't really have respect for the judicial sovereignty. You see what I mean? So my line of argumentation was, by using these classical Latin argumentative lines, they got away with substantive categories explaining justice. But they didn't want to get away with its compulsory force. And thereby, they made quite some effort with broad impact to convince people that legal proceedings, justice, especially at the last day, are very severe and strict. And well, it's such a fascinating primary source. Therefore, I loved to bring that forward to you. And perhaps just one, I don't have enough time for 1 minute. It's too nice. If you look to this illustration of the Last Judgment, you have here in the middle of it, you have Mother Mary and you have John the Apostle. So they were sort of like trying to get sort of like mercy forward next to the sword, and here the Archangel Michael. And why I make this point is the following. This kind of deesis you can find, for example, at the Bamberg Dome. Bamberg Dome was founded by Henry II, so the brother of your Gisela. You find it in Chartres, you find it in Paris, Notre Dame. So the idea that Last Judgment is explained as a legal proceeding, But in these medieval times, in Bamberg, you find the hands of Mary just to the feet of Jesus, so that she gets him there. There is mercy. Yeah, this is really, it's this Renaissance argument where they get separated and they don't get through. But I think this is a marvelous illustration. This is my last point, and I was sort of like attracted by Norbert's idea to say, go back to the past and invent the future, because I felt that also the humanists, with their engagement within public discourses, they tried to influence the contemporaries' idea of how to shape the future. And the point I'm trying to make is, if you take the slide with the autonomous will of the human being, and if you take this as an argument, not as a substantive truth, just as an argument, you could go on to say, well, if man is free to shape his world, then world is not itself in order. And most of you would say, well, this is one of those turns from medieval time to early modern time. And if world is not itself in order, and if you look around in contemporary times, this is one of the prevailing feeling. It is not in order, because we don't really understand what the world is about for the moment, what the role of justice and law is about, how we could bring those clever ideas more forward to the attention of the rulers. But if this is not taken for granted, and everything is then argumentatively called back to the will of the human subject, then if we go there, there is a volenti non fit injuria. So if we make up communities, societies, we only do that by will, then we have consented into it, and then there is no substantive, ethical, natural law, metaphysical ground, which is taken for granted. And this goes right into the Leviathan state thinking. Well, it's just one idea, but I would say it's not that far away that there is a heavy connection between the humanist argumentation and then the rise of mathematical thinking. One guy who really impressed me, you mentioned this legal thinking between art and mathematics, is Pascal. Of course, he's nearly 100 years later, but from humanist points, looking into future, it's fascinating how he tries to explain the existence of God or the non-existence by mathematical probabilities. Therefore, also trying to get confessional truth out of the realm of categorical truth and using this utility probability argument just to make pragmatic decisions. This, from my point of view, happens to set a specific focus on liberty. We had the individual will, liberty, and I've got the impression that from there on, within the constitutional discussions, justice isn't that prominent anymore. So if you look to, I know it's a great jump, but I would like to discuss my ideas, so I'm trying to provoke questions by huge jumps. If you look to the first constitutions, like the American one nowadays, awfully under stress, and of course the Polish one, in between the French one of 1791, you don't find any mentions of justice. But for liberty and safety, within the common law regime of America, for property, they all go. So this is sort of like the very, very broad theme of this introductory speech that justice as substance has lost territory, and it might be up to us now to bring it back to the stage. Thanks a lot. I'm sorry I prevented the que je nomme un figilemit. I prevented the Hungarian. Thanks a lot. Shall I keep? Take a break. Yeah, it's okay. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Professor Mussig. What a wonderful tour through the tracing of ideas. A formative period for what we regard as modern, or at least from early modern into modern, and you even brought it forward to codes and what we think of as characteristic parts of the modern legal order. I was struck slightly, if you don't mind a flippant comment, by how tracing ideas is incredibly difficult, and I would not have wanted to attempt to do what you have so successfully done. But that kind of tracing of ideas is something that we are all engaged in different ways. When we talk about sources from a particular location, a nexus, an instance of an idea, through to seeing what effect it had on legal actors. It's not dramatically unlike the movement that Szeged is particularly famous for amongst culinary interests, which is paprika. As you may all know, the modern form of paprika that most of us eat actually originated in Szeged in 1920, but its origin started somewhere very different, from the Amazon to Mexico to the Iberian Peninsula, then through to Africa and Asia and up through the Balkans to Central Europe. But it was spicy until the 1920s. And we all, I certainly did not know that until I was starting to research what I was going to get to do when I come to Szeged. So that the movement of an idea can still keep the same title even if the content dramatically changes. And as you ended, sometimes that title, here the word justice, can actually disappear from some of our foundational texts. Professor Mussig has kindly agreed to take questions. I'm going to turn it over to the floor now. Please, if possible, keep your question or comment relatively brief and concise. And if at all possible, though I know I have the privilege of knowing many of you in the room, it seems invidious to only be able to say the names of those I do know. So I will call to you, but please identify yourself first, just saying your name and institution. That's generally speaking a helpful thing to do. Don't worry if you forget, I'll try and remind you. So, who has a comment or a question for our keynote speaker? Bearing in mind, your questions and comments are going to be a lot better than mine, so please you do it, because if I ask a question, it's going to be much worse. What did I just say? My questions will be worse than yours, so please. Yes. If you don't mind being very loud.
Yes, my name is and I think the last about 3 years my question is, to what extent in this transition to the Renaissance time, what precedes it? Thank you very much. So what precedes it, to what extent does religion, especially institutionalized religion, play a role? Because I'm not sure, you said at some point that you wanted to move this to sort of away from the legal experts and into the common sense area. But with the early Middle Ages, I'm not sure to what extent that makes sense, in as much as the vast majority of the population not necessarily coming along with the scholars, and I'm wondering if it was really justice or whether this is God-given and therefore to be accepted.
Committed to that?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Judith, for the question. The point I was trying to make is the following. I would say I only have to cope with a step. The point I was trying to make is, I would say within
the medieval Christian theology, you use justice as a moral correctness, as an overlaying scheme where you have to measure all your decisions against. So if you take, for example, Romanus Egidius' Mirror of Princes, or Thomas Aquinas' Mirror of Princes, this would be the argumentative scheme. So there is a difference, a gap, between what is publicly right and what the ruler or the private man decides. And the only point I'm trying to make is, if I read those sources of the early humanist Renaissance, I have the impression that by using those classical sources in this immediate access, they don't have those two scales. They say, well, it's ethics qua ethics, it's politics qua politics. I'm struggling now for years trying really to understand this early modern Aristotelianism, and I have not really reached, therefore I was not reusing this point that politics was invented as sort of like a separate sphere. I would more say it was a kind of discourse. They used the Aristotelian language as a language. And by this using it, they got away with the differentiation between, if you take Thomas Aquinas to say there must be an ideal commonwealth, and then all these human societies trying to get up to this ideal, and we always have this gap. And all my point was they got rid of the gap. And this was not a secularization. I'm really thankful for your point to say, well, of course they are kept by religion. Therefore, I used this Last Judgment play. Well, it's a play where you have, I only had the 9th part, but you have all the other parts. You have Godfather complaining that this Last Judgment is on a Good Friday, and he says this is not a good day. And then you have the Diabolus, who shows up and say, oh no, sorry, Godfather, you have to follow the legal proceeding even if it's on Good Friday. So you have all those sort of like changing, but very, very heavily religiously influenced discourse, and this is the point I was trying to make. I would say this new Aristotelianism is a shift of discourse, but it happens then to offer arguments that within classical times, as Tacitus, it could be utile, it could be plausible to accept injustice. This is sort of like my point. This was no longer a sin to use the historical example of injustice. Mm-hmm.
Just
Stay there, you don't mind. Yeah. Oh,
But do you mean in line with the change, the societal change that comes through?
Of course.
The extension of those who are addressed by it.
Yeah, of course, within the setting. And it was in the slide, there was an openness of these sodalities of Celtis towards burghers. Therefore, I said, well, the capability to speak the classic Latin was not a conditio sine qua non. If you are a wealthy burgher and you're important enough for the city council, you had some chance to get into those circles. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There was another one, Austin.
Thank you very much. Agustín Clarice from Maastricht University. For your presentation, at some moment I felt I was in a room with all of these actors and materials. You really transported us there. And today, earlier in the PhD workshop, we were speaking about myths and uncontested dogmas and storylines. And today you walked us through a different set of actors and documents and situations. And I was trying to see there were people, for example, on the side, what we call secondary actors or supporting roles, that we need them in order to have the play. You, a few minutes ago, you even mentioned a few of those. I was wondering if you could tell us, without doing another paper, because it's not a limitation for another paper, but as a reflection on what you found so far, if you could tell us something about those secondary actors or secondary elements in your story. How were you challenged by those? Why you left them aside? Why you brought others in? So a little bit of how your storyline came together with that struggle between primary and secondary actors.
Okay.
Thank you. It's an invitation.
Yeah, well, this is a very clever question. There's a very simple answer. I was so happy to find this Last Judgment play by Ulrich Tengler. I haven't known that last year. It just came across because we had a huge research project. Simply we got money to make a new critical edition of the lay mirror. On the last page of my slides, there is the book that we edited by that. And rereading these primary sources, I just happened to find this Last Judgment play. And then I was fascinated by, how shall I say that, to explain law by bringing it to the stage. Well, it's like a theatre play for those contemporaries. And at the same day, because I'm constantly asking myself, do I really correctly explain modernity of early modern times? I think it's one of the most tricky questions. And I was also touched by the heavy religious impacts. So having Mother Mary on stage, Diabolos on stage, Godfather, and all those figures, making also sort of like in this reformatory scene, testing your individual decisions, it's like a public confession or a performance confession for the contemporaries. So there's a pragmatic answer. I was so fascinated by Ulrich Tengler, and then I realized he used the same guy to illustrate his lay mirror as Luther happened to have. And there I found connection to my argument that there is Aristotelianism at this time is not a concept, but more a public language. And therefrom I started to think. Then I came across, and it's still constantly I try to understand. I've got those, how shall I say that, preferred guys I try to understand. I try to understand Augustinus, I try to understand Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle, and Erasmus. And I have not reached to understand any of them, but I'm, how should I say that, deeply impressed by the kind of, well, this is really, really tricky. I'm really impressed by the kind of rhetoric approach to religion that Erasmus uses. And of course, I know all these letters he's writing to Luther, that he's sort of like he was inventing the egg, and Luther he was hatching the egg, and he took so long years to break away with Luther. But sort of like this fueled my idea that there is a great deal about language, how to use arguments, and not to use them in a given categorical way, but very experimental. And this very experimental, what Erasmus does with biblical text, this clings then to the upcoming interest into explaining nature by mathematical laws. And mathematical laws, and this is sort of like how it how it closes the circle against mathematics is not that dangerous once you understand it. It's not anti-clerical, so you can think whatever you'd love to do. But of course, Galilei, he had his problems, but in theory, it was a language which was neutral enough to invent new things. This is the first point. And on the other hand, and I think this is really, really tricky, if you go for this Torricelli experiment to explain that there is a nothing, that the empty room is not nothing, but there is something, and the Aristotelian physics hasn't really thought about the nothing. And from that on, they say, well, these mathematical laws, they are so binding, they are over-existing. So also God has to be under those mathematical laws. And from there on, they then continue further more. So to be very open, it was my fascinating. I always explain students, all law happens to be in language. And that's it. And therefore you have to be, and this is sort of like looking into the future, I would say if you are a ruler, you have to be very, very, very cautious about the words you are using. And if we look to the German discourse, it's a mess. There's nobody who really has a clue what kind of language responsibility you have as a politician for a respectful discourse. Well, I'm ashamed by a chancellor who says, well, the Israelis, they do the Drecksarbeit. I don't really know the English word. It's like, the dirty work or whatsoever. How could you speak about bombs, even if you don't like those who suffer from them, to say it's Drecksarbeit? So this is the kind of respectfulness of discourse I would say one could learn from this humanist example, using classical arguments to explain their contemporary times to shape the future.
So we've probably got time for one more question. Yes, just here.
Okay, hi, Mr. Montana University. First and foremost, thank you very much for this lovely presentation. It's been quite a challenge to navigate all those ideas. And so, if I may, I would like to ask you to develop on one allegory in specific. You've showed the discussion between mercy and justice. So my question is, how does these two actually relate to each other? Because if we're talking about Renaissance justice, one of the aspects is also that it becomes more severe. For things to be punished, for example, in the 1400s, you will get executed in the 1500s.
Yeah.
So how does this relate?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I think the starting point for the setting of the Last Judgment play is the old idea of God's daughters. There you have justice and mercy sitting within it. But then it goes on within this allegorical use to make a very fine distinction. And we should now I would have to go really back to the exact wording. Mercy makes it very clear in her arguments that she's not asking for dispensation or any exception. What she is asking for, and I think this alone is fascinating, a fascinating use of humanist argumentation. She is asking for a kind of general benevolence. So if you go back to what Aristotle, and there you've got again this modern Aristotelian discourse, what he says about this kind of epikeia, well, Grotius says then he reuses it. Aristotle says, well, all this stuff for laws is so complicated that it is not possible to foresee any conditions of the applicability of laws. And therefore, you always have holes within, even if you comprehensively codify, you cannot really catch any case. And because this is so, it is better to be, it's not to make an exemption from the rule, but it's better to be, I translate, we discussed the ancient Greek yesterday evening, I translate it as a kind of kindness in justice. So you have to apply justice in the kind manner. If you know the German historical discourse of Michael Kohlhaas, if you know the Roman saying summum jus summa injuria, you know what kindness in justice means, what is sort of like, it's like the counterpart of that. You could be very, very strict, apply only the letter of the law, but this is not the kind of strictness. The allegorical figure of justice stands in this dispute. This is the interesting thing. So, to be very short, mercy says, I'm not misericordia. I'm not asking for exemption. I only ask for a kind attitude. And then Tengler goes on and says, well, this is a good attitude for all lawyers. This is a good attitude for all professors and experts. And of course, and this really touches me, it's also a good attitude of the last judge coming up. Well, if you stand there as a sinner or a righteous, on both sides, it's good to have a benevolent judge. Yeah? And justice makes the point not to say, well, we have to be strict, you have to be strict. No, it's more clever. Justice in this allegorical dispute says, of course, there must be misericordia. And of course, there are settings where you have to have exemptions from rules. But this is only during lifetime. So justice makes up an argumentative difference between misericordia, gratia, during life. Tengler says, well, during your life, you should remember your God and always try to get away with your sins, and then you're on the safe track. But if you haven't sort of like regarded well enough this safe track, and if you now happen to have this last day, last judgment, then justice, the allegorical figure says, there is a time gap between misericordia during lifetime and now strict justice at the last judgment, because otherwise we wouldn't have this binding force of judicial sovereignty. You see what I mean? If you get away with justice as a superior categorical content, you need to have binding judicial sovereignty. And this is the argument of justice in this allegorical talk. I could only invite you to read it. It's marvelous. Read the whole play. It's fascinating. Yeah, it's fascinating how the Diabolus counter-argues Holy Mary. Holy Mary tries to get up with legal arguments. It's brilliant. It's really brilliant. Yeah. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Mussig. We're about to move to the final stage of the opening session. A couple of quick notes from me before we do that. First off, if you're new to the conference, a particular welcome. If you're not as new, but you might like this reminder, please do engage with each other. If there's someone here who you want to talk to, no matter your station and no matter theirs, politely introduce yourself and ask if they have a moment to talk. It could be about something they've written, it could be about something you've written. So that person might not have a moment then, and I'm imagining Professor Mussig might get swamped soon after this event, for instance, but at least try. We're a space where we're open to that kind of discussion. One of the key things that you might have noticed from that keynote, one of the marks of scholarship that we're all aspiring to, is the ability to judge when something actually does pan out, to decide whether this and that really does lead to your next idea, tracing the process of movement of a concept is very difficult, and it requires the kind of judgment that gets honed over time and experience. It's something that's particularly difficult when you start out doing your PhD, because what experience could you know? How could you decide, you think to yourself? Well, one of the ways to help is to talk to us who've been doing it for a little bit longer. Why that we make the decisions we make. Doesn't mean we're right, but at least you might see why we're making those decisions. Second, after this session finishes, we have a 10-minute break when you may wish to make use of the facilities. But afterwards, the 4 conference rooms that you'll be going to for the first set of panels, panels 1 to 4, are JK 201, 203, 206, 208. And so essentially they're just 1 floor up and around the space of this room. So they're quite accessible and easy to get to. A final thank you again from me, and I'll invite Kata to come back up.
Thank you for the great presentation and the perfect moderation from the host. The keynote presentation of the first day has now concluded. Finally, we would like to express our sincere thanks to the sponsors of the conference, Legal Landskap, the National Research, Development and Innovation Fund, and Mezza Natura Grant for their generous support. We would like to thank Max Planck Institute for Legal History and Legal Theory for allowing us to exhibit their books and for the generous donation for the library. We kindly ask you to make your way to the designated panel rooms to begin the section meetings. Thank you very much.
So I take that. I take that.
Super, hervorragend, tatsächlich schön.
Schön.
Darf ich ganz kurz was vorschlagen? Morgen
Ja.
15.
Ja.
Also
Ja, gerne. Ja, gerne. Ich freue mich. Ja, toll. Vielen, vielen Dank.
Okay.
Danke, hervorragend.